It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP, Jake Berry, the Labour peer, Shami Chakrabarti, the Guardian's North of England editor, Helen Pidd, and former Conservative Special Advisor, Mo Hussein. Today, the government publishes its flagship plan to level up the UK.
We want to make sure that overlooked and undervalued communities get the support they need.
A lot of the problems that Michael Gove is trying to solve at the moment are of the government's own making.
Just withdraw the words.
I am standing up for my constituents that know that this Prime Minister has lied and misled the House.
That had the SNP's Westminster leader ordered out of the Commons chamber. The same day, Boris Johnson was allowed to make a false claim about Keir Starmer. So are Parliament's rules fit for purpose?
While they may not have been disorderly, I am far from satisfied that the comments in question were appropriate on this occasion.
The Prime Minister has returned from Ukraine to more colleagues calling on him to resign. He'll return to the domestic front at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll be there live at noon. And after another scandal in the Force, can the head of the Met stay in her job? Let's start with this story on the front page of the Daily Express. It's also on other front pages and being read on the BBC website. This is the money that was spent or wasted, as the Daily Express has put it. Scandalous £8.7 billion of your money wasted following the release of the Department of Health and Social Care's accounts that shows the money that was spent on personal protective equipment, amongst other things. Mo, starting with you, wasted money or necessary spend and loss in a pandemic emergency?
I think it was necessary. I think when you're in government, you have to take decisions in real time. This was an issue that hadn't been dealt with before. It was fast moving. We don't have the luxury of time, so decisions were made. Clearly, they need to be looked at. There were some issues around contracts being awarded, but in the moment, I think it was the right thing to do.
Can I just give our viewers an idea of the breakdown of where that money went? It has £673 million for items not suitable for any use, £2.5 million for items not suitable for use in the NHS, but which may be suitable for other uses. By far the largest amount, £4.7 billion, as a result of fluctuations in market price between point of purchase and balance sheet date, and £750 million for excess inventory, which has an expiry date prior to the expected usage date. What about you, Helen? Was it necessary, this money, at the time of an emergency in a pandemic, or was it wasted?
I think when I first saw the headline figure, I thought, blimey O'Reilly. When you look at it, when you kind of break down the figures, it isn't quite as shocking as it might first seem. But the problem is this is a government that has shown that they can't be trusted to spend money properly and to keep track of where the money's gone. And the biggest example of that, of course, was a minister resigning in the House of Lords last week. And I think the other thing that really gets my goat is the sort of cronyism of how all of these PPE contracts were rewarded. You know, the fact that Matt Hancock, the then Health Secretary, that his pub landlord ended up getting a contract. I mean, it's pretty grim stuff. Right, well, Jake, let me just point you and our other guests and viewers to the front page of the Daily Mail. What a £13 billion waste. That's because they're also rolling in £4.3 billion lost to COVID loan fraud. But that point made by Helen, that the Treasury Minister himself, representing the government, he was in charge of this stuff, Lord Agnew, just walked out the House of Lords. He said, I can't stay in my job, I've got to resign. I mean, that does tell you something, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not going to try and defend £13 billion of waste of taxpayers' money because it is indefensible. However, let's be absolutely clear, a big portion of this is the government having to pay excess prices for PPE. We were on a war footing, effectively, as a country, and we need to decide, in truth, we're always sorry to see this money wasted, but we need to decide what would we have preferred not to have had this PPE and people working in our NHS to have died of COVID or have spent this money and got the right PPE for them. I think that the judgment the government took was the right one, and we made other judgments, like we spent £70 billion supporting people through the furlough scheme. Again, I think that was the right thing to do because it was about ensuring that people kept their jobs.
But
it was an emergency situation. The government reacted.
Why are you calling it wasted?
It's been demonstrated as waste, and I'm certainly not going to say that is a good thing because it's not, because I, like everyone else watching this programme, is a taxpayer and I expect my money to be spent well because it is my money, not the government's money. But the point is that it was an emergency situation with the government effectively on a war footing.
Well, two points from my perspective. The first is I sat almost opposite Lord Agnew last week, and I've seen him many times in the House of Lords. A very loyal Conservative minister. He was very, very angry. It's something that I've rarely witnessed before. He was so angry. He was ashamed to be the anti-corruption minister in what he called an indolent, arrogant government that just wasn't getting a grip on corruption. The second perspective I have was right at the beginning of the pandemic. I sat with Matt Hancock and his officials in the Cabinet Office and in the Department of Health, and we were looking at the emergency powers in draft. And they were breathtaking. And of course, we know that the people who actually obeyed those regulations paid a huge price in not seeing relatives, etc., and not being able to go to work and so on. But I remember saying to him, these are breathtaking powers. They may be necessary, but they're lopsided. Where are the emergency powers to requisition plant and equipment and to stop people profiteering and to make sure that we can have what we need in this pandemic? And he and his officials looked at me blankly. You say we had to pay these high prices. We didn't. It was a war footing. It was an emergency. Why was the government not prepared to interfere with the businesses that were corrupt and profitting out of people's misery?
There's a global market for PPE. We don't manufacture much of it in this country. Actually, that is something we should seek to change. But there's a global market for PPE, so we weren't bidding against privateering companies. We were bidding against Singapore, Germany, France, Spain. So the government had to pay the price to ensure that people working in our NHS keep us safe, to stop us dying of COVID.
We had people going in bin bags to work on the front line in the NHS, but wrapped in bin bags. Partly it was poor planning and austerity in the first place.
You can't say, the government shouldn't have paid for PPE, whatever the price to get it for people in the NHS, or on the alternative say, well, actually, people didn't have enough and that was wrong. I think people not having PPE was wrong, and that's why, although I'm sorry to see this waste, the government did the right thing by prioritising getting PPE onto our front line during a crisis.
All right, you're sorry to see the waste, as you call it. That £13 billion on the front page of the Daily Mail is the equivalent, they say, of the cost of the national insurance hike of 1.25 percentage points coming in April. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say the £13 billion is dwarfed by the £400 billion that we have spent during the COVID pandemic. For that, we could almost, abolish the taxation system full stop. But I still think the government did the right thing. It is surely the job of the government, when your people and your country need you the most, to spend taxpayers' money in keeping people in work, keeping people working in our NHS safe, and ensuring that as an economy we can be the fastest growing economy in the G7 and actually the most open economy now in the world after COVID.
That's also because the UK economy shrank the most during parts of the pandemic, which is why the bounce back has been quite dramatic. But you're happy to keep that national insurance hike?
No, I don't think the national insurance hike is the right thing to do. You don't actually ask me that question, but I never supported the national insurance when it came to Parliament in the first place. I continue to hope that the government will think again, and even if it does introduce it doesn't look like it, but even if it does introduce it, I would like to see us keep it under review.
All right, let's talk about the government's big policy announcement today. That is the long-awaited Levelling Up white paper being published later. There'll also be a statement from the Levelling Up, Secretary of State Michael Gove in the Commons. This, of course, is about the government's plans to bring parts of the north and so-called left-behind parts of the UK in line with more prosperous parts of the country, namely London and the South East. Let's listen to Michael Gove talking to my colleague Alex Forsyth.
There's going to be a shift both of power and money away from London and the South East towards the North and Midlands and indeed every part of the United Kingdom. For too long, our country's been over-centralised, and you've had the elites in London who haven't really understood all of the problems the people in communities like Grimsby and Cleethorpes face. So there's going to be more power for local communities, and also the public money, the taxpayers' money that government spends, is going to be spent closer to those communities.
Yes, Michael Gove by Noisy Waves in Grimsby. I hope you caught what he said. He did talk about the elites in London. For too long, our country's been over-centralised. Jake, you've talked about southern privilege. What do you mean exactly?
Well, I mean that if you live in the south of England, you will live longer, earn more money and get a better quality of education. As someone who's born, bred in the north, lived and worked in the north my whole life, I think that's completely unacceptable. And that's why I welcome today the government's white paper. There is no quick fix when it comes to changing that southern privilege, ensuring that people in the north can reach their full potential. And that's why the white paper has set out long-term goals up until 2030, but in fact it will need to go far beyond that, up until 2030, to tackle some of those inequalities we see between the north and south of England.
Shami, is there such a thing as southern privilege in the way you've just heard Jake explain, and also Michael Gove, the elites in London?
Absolutely, absolutely there is. But I think we need more than gimmicks and more than Boris boroughs and sort of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. We need real investment, and we need investment in industry and in institutions, but also in people. I think a minimum wage, the current minimum wage is less than £10 an hour, and there are people who are working in care homes on that wage and barely making ends meet, and that's all over the country. So yes, there are places in the country, particularly in the north, that are particularly disadvantaged. We've got life expectancy going down. In parts of Wales, we've got life expectancy in the 50s. So it's a massive problem, but it takes ambition and investment, not just slogans like we'll have Boris boroughs and more mayors.
Is it just about gimmicks, Mo?
I don't think so. I think today we've seen a lot more detail, and it isn't just about the big ticket infrastructure items as well. There is a case to look at health inequalities, education inequalities. This is what it's trying to do. These things are not always the most tangible things for people, and they will take time. I think the risk with this is, though, if you bash the South too much, does this turn off southern MPs? Do they think they're being levelled down so the north is levelled up? And I think the government has to get that narrative right, because it could end up being counterproductive.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because the government still has to, in this white paper, set out the economic rationale behind levelling up. Because in truth, if you want to sell the concept of levelling up to people who live in Surrey or Essex or Kent or whatever it may be, they have to understand this isn't about dragging them down. It's about improving productivity in the north. And just quickly on the scale of the challenge, the income disparity between the poorest parts of the north of England and the richest parts of the south are greater than the disparities between East and West Germany before the Berlin Wall fell. That tells you how huge this challenge is and how successive governments have failed to deliver for the people of the north.
Well, on that subject, Helen, there is some research from the think tank More in Common. Let's have a look at this quote from their report about levelling up that came out last week. 3 in 5 Britons consider it fair that places like London and the South East become less wealthy and prosperous to reduce inequality between different regions of the UK. Is that what people are expecting from levelling up?
Well, I think most probably ordinary people are still kind of confused and in the dark about what levelling up means. I think it's kind of dangerous to pit parts of the country against each other, and there's parts of London that have extremely poor life expectancies and kind of life outcomes, just like places such as Blackpool, Stockport, where I am. I saw yesterday that the healthy life expectancy where I live has actually gone down for women. Kind of annoys me, though, that we're sitting here talking about a paper that hasn't been published yet. We're just relying on all of the government spin. Michael Gove, saying whatever he wants on the radio this morning. And then by the time the report comes out later, everybody will have lost interest. I think one thing, however, that has been trailed in the report is more mayors for the rest of the country. And I think that's quite dangerous if you introduce more mayors without giving them more powers and more money. Otherwise, you essentially devolve blame. And you'll have a situation like we have in Greater Manchester at the moment, where Andy Burnham is facing the biggest crisis of his mayoralty. He was King of the North last year because he has to. The government has told him to implement a clean air zone in Greater Manchester. And people hate it. A lot of people hate it because it means they have to pay more to drive their polluting cars into all of the 10 boroughs. So I think I'm quite sceptical about what all of this means if it doesn't come with money and power.
Right. Just before I get you to respond, you were saying that isn't true. But hang on just one moment, because I want to just tell our viewers, because they may not know, as I think a lot of people don't know, about what we might expect. The government is saying it's focusing on 12 missions, including boosting productivity, improving local transport and increasing skills training for adults. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But just to respond to what Helen was saying about the position of Andy Burnham, devolution, not real devolution.
Well, I don't agree. Very briefly on the clean air zone, the government told Andy Burnham that he needed to come up with a plan to tackle air quality on around a dozen roads. And his response to that was to create a 500-mile clean air zone, which, if you happen to travel anywhere on a bus, will cost your bus company £20,000 a year for it to go from constituencies like mine in Rossendale and East Lancashire and Darwin into Greater Manchester. So he does have the responsibility for that, but it was a local decision to implement this huge congestion charge, biggest in the country, covering over 500 miles. And actually, if devolution is to work, Andy Burnham needs to step forward and take responsibility for that. On the issue of devolution, there's of course the announcement in the white paper, and we are just limited by what we've seen so far, of a mayor for the city of York and North Yorkshire. I'm a great believer in mayors. Actually, many Conservative MPs oppose them. I don't. I'm a big supporter of them. And I think our problem with devolution isn't that we have too much devolution, is that we don't have enough. And what I would like to see is mayoral devolution across the whole country, because those powerfully elected individuals are changing economies and lives in Manchester, Liverpool.
But what about Helen's point? What about Helen's point that you can devolve blame if you don't give people the resources to and the power and the resources to spend on public services and so on? You just blame the local mayor for the fact that the central government is starving certain regions of investment.
Gain share, which is a decadal guaranteed income. They have the right to raise local taxes by way of a precept. Andy Burnham has just had hundreds of millions of pounds subsidy from the government to introduce smart ticketing across Manchester. They do, I'm sorry, it's just not correct to say that they don't get the resources. They have their guaranteed income, their gain share, plus they get huge amounts of money from things like transforming cities.
Although one of the things, Mo, that people will point to is the money that's been taken out of local government and local authorities over a decade or so. And that makes it much harder to claim that new investment and new money is going in from the government. A lot of what is being announced is old. It's reheated policies. Yes, there is £100 million of new money, but that is a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely gaps in this on the financial side. And I think we have to be honest and say a white paper is not going to level up the entire country. It's about action. It's about what is delivered afterwards. And it's really about the change that people feel and see in their everyday lives for the better. And the 2030 deadlines the government has set, on one hand, great for accountability, but what will happen by the next election? Will enough be done by the next election? Does that cause a political challenge for the government going forward?
Well, that is a political challenge. You yourself have said it's got to go beyond 2030. The next election could be 2024. Will anyone have seen anything of any real benefit in the next few years?
Well, I haven't believed they would, and of course the government's already levelling up through things like town deals. It's investing in our high streets, which again is in the white paper. But let's be absolutely clear. I think people of the North, and I am one of them, understand that there's no quick fix for this. But for the first time in living memory, we have a government and a Prime Minister who has a shared value set with people of the North who simply just want the same opportunities, the same chances that people take for granted in other parts of the country. And I think through this white paper today, we've demonstrated that compelling vision of the Prime Minister is being put into action.
All right. Very briefly, Shami, I know that you don't buy into this idea, but do you agree the ambition is there? And obviously you've got to wait for delivery.
I want to see food banks closing because people aren't living in food poverty, including people who are working on the front line of the NHS. I want to see those kind of real changes rather than slogans and narratives. And as for these shared values that we're all having with the Prime Minister, I think we'll probably get onto that discussion in a moment.
We will. And at this point, let me welcome Brendan O'Hara from the SNP. Hello to you, because we're going to have a discussion about parliamentary language. You'll remember earlier in the week, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a statement on the Sue Gray update into Downing Street parties. There were some pretty fiery exchanges in the House of Commons. It was a brutal session, actually, in the afternoon. One of them was between the leader of the SNP in Westminster, Ian Blackford, and Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker. Let's have a look.
He misled the House. He must now resign.
Order. You'll have to withdraw that last comment.
Mr. Speaker, I gave the evidence of the 8th of December.
Order. You're going to have to withdraw misled.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has misled the House.
Unless you withdraw, I'll have to stop, and that's not good. Just withdraw the words.
I am standing up for my constituents that know that this Prime Minister has lied and misled the House.
Give me the paper. Give me the paper.
Well, very clear what Ian Blackford was saying about the Prime Minister in the Commons chamber. Brendan, as you know, as we all know, there is parliamentary language and rules around that. You can't call people liars. And he had to leave, and he did leave. What was your reaction?
I think Ian was absolutely right to do what he did. By the same token, I think the Speaker was right to do what he did, because the Speaker is there to apply the rules, and the rules say that you cannot do that. But let's face it, the public now look at this and think that the rules are absurd. And I can only presume that the rules were written at a time when everyone assumed or believed or hoped that a Prime Minister would always be truthful and honest and have a shred of integrity. And unfortunately, we have a Prime Minister who is deficient in all three of those characters. And so we now have a situation where one is punished for calling out the lie, whereas the person who lies is scot-free to continue repeating the lie.
Jake, should Ian Blackford have withdrawn those comments?
Well, it's up to Ian to say whether he should withdraw them. I don't agree with him. But I do think it's important that we do try and maintain dignity and respect in debates in Parliament. I think it's perfectly possible to disagree with someone without being disagreeable. And I think if we allow politics to break down into name-calling and catcalling, then in fact our whole system is the poor. And I know that the public doesn't like to see that sort of playground calling in Parliament.
Right, well, you say... Sorry, go on, Brendan.
So I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think when you have a Prime Minister who is so distant from the truth, whose default position is to lie, then the public have a right to have that called out. Now, it's sad that it has come to this, but it hasn't come to this by Ian's actions. It's come to this through the Prime Minister's actions, and he is at fault.
Jake?
Well, I understand that that's Ian Blackford's position. It's not one I accept, and I just go back. I think we agree, actually, that it's really important that we maintain high standards of debate and respect in Parliament, because it's just better for our country and for our politics.
Well, talking of high standards in terms of the conversation and level of debate in the House of Commons, what did you make of this? Because during that same session, the Prime Minister said this about the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. He said this leader of the opposition, a former director of public prosecutions, although he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out, chose to use this moment continually to prejudge a police inquiry. Let's talk to Will Moy, Chief Executive of Full Fact, the UK's independent fact-checking organisation. This isn't a new accusation. It's the first time the Prime Minister has said it. Where did it come from, and is there any evidence at all for it?
It's been going around for several years. It peaked when Keir Starmer became leader of the opposition. So we first fact-checked it in June 2020 because it's been floating around online. Where it comes from is the fact that Mr. Starmer was head of the Crown Prosecution Service when the decision was made not to prosecute Savile, but he was not the reviewing lawyer for the case. He actually later commissioned an official investigation which criticised the decisions by the prosecutors and the police and the way they handled the allegations, and concluded that there might have been a prospect of a successful prosecution. But there's no evidence that Keir Starmer was personally involved. He was, however, leading the organisation that made that decision. Right,
Will, do stay with us. Well, Jake, following on from your line about high standards in Parliament, should Boris Johnson withdraw those comments?
Well, let's look at the fact. It's really interesting to hear the facts. But Keir Starmer was head of the Crown Prosecution Service when this allegation came in about Jimmy Savile, one of Britain's most vile and prolific sex offenders. The Crown Prosecution Service decided not to proceed with the prosecution, which would have seen Jimmy Savile prosecuted in his lifetime for horrendous crimes. Keir Starmer was head of the service. He commissioned this report, and at the conclusion of the report, on the 11th of January 2013, he apologised. So it's now for the British public to decide whether he meant that apology and took responsibility for the failings of the Crown's prosecution service in this regard.
But Jake,
or if he didn't mean that apology, was he insincere? That's for the British public to decide.
He was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. He was not the reviewing lawyer in the case of Jimmy Savile. So
but we have heard from Keir Starmer
made by Boris Johnson
time in the last few weeks,
don't interrupt.
if you head an organisation, you are responsible for the decisions made. And he believes that. He did take responsibility because he apologised.
So here's the thing. Boris Johnson chooses to ventilate this particular issue, not in a debate about our criminal justice system, not in a debate about the competence of successive directors of public prosecutions, but in self-defence, lashing back because he is currently being investigated personally by the Metropolitan Police. So if we're talking about conduct in Parliament and conduct in public life, if this was a genuine concern that the Prime Minister had, that Keir Starmer had somehow covered up for Jimmy Savile, that Keir Starmer, was not a competent director of public prosecutions, would he have raised it in that way? Even if you're right, and even if somehow Keir is personally to blame for failings in the CPS when he led it. Does that compare to a Prime Minister who is currently personally being investigated by the Metropolitan Police?
It's really interesting what you say, because you said at the start of your comments that Keir Starmer has accepted responsibility for this. I don't think he has, actually. He toured the television stations afterwards, saying it was a smear, saying it was a lie. I go back to the facts of the situation. He was head of the CPS. They failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, for which he apologised. Now, did he mean that apology? Yes or no? And he can't say that he had nothing to do with it if he meant the apology.
This is a dance that you're doing. Go back to what the Prime Minister actually said. He said that Starmer spent his time prosecuting journalists and not prosecuting Jimmy Savile.
It was not his decision, and some of your Conservative colleagues have come out very strongly to say that the allegation is false. Simon Hoare has said, for what it's worth, the Sue Gray report must be published in full. Likewise, any Met report. If fines are issued, we should know the Jimmy Savile false allegation should be withdrawn. He calls it a false allegation. So did Julian Smith, the former Chief Whip and Northern Ireland Secretary, and so did Bob Neal. Again, do you think Boris Johnson should withdraw what was a false allegation?
I don't think he should, because the question of why Keir Starmer, who headed the organisation that failed to prosecute, they are the facts. They are the facts of his own independent report he commissioned, for which he apologised. So I want to hear from Keir Starmer if he believes he had no responsibility for this whatsoever, which is his current position and is the position of the Labour Party, why on the 11th of January 2013 did he issue an apology?
Will, what do you make of what you've heard from Jake Berry?
Well, it's very important for a fact checker looks at what exactly was said. What Boris Johnson accused Keir Starmer of doing is failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile. Now, you can interpret that in different ways, and your viewers will have to make their minds up. You can interpret it as attacking him for being in charge of an organisation where someone else made that decision, later commissioning a report into it which criticised that decision and accepting the findings of that report, or you can interpret it as some of the MPs on his own side as a smear on Starmer. What we do know, looking at misinformation online, is the predictable response to this from online communities. This is an allegation about sexual abuse, vile sexual abuse, and we would hope that any serious politician would be very careful and very specific in criticising others in public life in that context. Given the reaction, even from his own side, it's clear that the Prime Minister was not careful and specific in what he said on this case.
No, and in fact, the Prime Minister has doubled down on what he'd said in the way that Jake has to some extent. He told The Sun last night, as far as I'm aware, it's fairly accurate. Should he withdraw those comments, Mo?
He should withdraw those comments, because this is, I'm afraid, classic dead cat approach that the Prime Minister
Explain
uses.
That.
This is a trick that you use to redirect the conversation, to deflect attention from the issues at hand that were being discussed, which was Partygate, whether the people who made the rules followed the rules. And now we're talking about this other allegation, which was so incredulous and spoken behind parliamentary privilege. I'm afraid it's not the cut and thrust of politics. And I think, if you as a Prime Minister are trying to win back public trust, you're facing allegations of how can you reconcile comments you made about there were no parties, all the rules were followed, to now being investigated. Perhaps using something that has been widely discredited is not the right way of doing that.
All right, just before I come to you, Shami, Helen, the Speaker pointed out yesterday that Boris Johnson's remarks were not procedurally disorderly, although he went on to say that he didn't think the comments were appropriate. Parliamentary privilege exists for a reason, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And as Mo just said, I think what Boris Johnson did was tawdry, and it was an abuse of parliamentary privilege. And it's just so frustrating that we're sitting here talking about it. We've played right into Boris Johnson's hands by having a discussion about something which in many ways was sorted out many years ago when Keir Starmer commissioned this report into Jimmy Savile's, into why he wasn't prosecuted. So I feel like we've fallen hook, line and sinker for it. And I find that quite depressing.
Right. Well, I'll come back to both Jake and Shami in just a moment. I want a final word from Will, because Full Fact and others have been campaigning for some time about false claims. You've been calling for a simple and efficient system that allows all MPs to correct the official record. What would that look like?
Well, I think MPs don't realise how ridiculous they look from the outside. And whatever you make of this example, Boris Johnson has made other false claims that are demonstrably false. In recent weeks, he's been claiming that employment has been going up when it's going down. The Office for Statistics Regulation wrote to Number 10 about that just yesterday. So there are unambiguous examples of factual inaccuracies that are going uncorrected under the current system. There are two changes we need to make. Firstly, only ministers can formally correct the record in Hansard at the moment. That's ridiculous. We wrote to the Speaker about it last year. The Procedure Committee is meant to be considering it. They should change that rule straight away. Secondly, we need a system that deals with people who don't correct the record when they have an obligation to. And we think there's a simple way of doing that. You don't want somebody jumping in the middle of debate, calling people a liar. Absolutely. What you can have is an MP who's concerned that another member has misled the House, ask the House of Commons Library for an accurate assessment of that. They already have the power to do that. If the House Commons Library think it is inaccurate, ask that member to correct. They already have the power to do that. If that doesn't work, ask the Speaker to grant an urgent question for that to be debated. He already has the power to do that. And the thing I think we should add is if a member persistently makes false claims and persistently fails to correct them, that pattern of behaviour amounts to an abuse of the rules of the House. And at that point, the Speaker should have the power to step in and suspend them from the House, just as Ian Blackford was going to be thrown out of the House. So let's not have a constant tit for tat, but let's have a calm, deliberate process, mainly using existing rules that could be implemented next week to deal with people who persistently fail to correct the record when they should.
Brendan, would you sign up to that?
Well, I thought... No, I wouldn't, because I think this is not the time for calm. I think this is a time to be very, very frightened of where this is leading, because Mr Johnson knew exactly what he was saying, and he knew the hairs that he would set running. And it really is incumbent on his ministers to come out and call him out on this, because we're heading into a dangerous territory here. We're heading into the land of Donald Trump here, where that transfer from conspiracy, online right-wing conspiracy theorists comes into the mainstream, and it cannot be allowed to go unchallenged. And what's happening is that hitherto good people, good ministers, are doubling down on this and sacrificing their own personal reputation to save this guy, and because it's an appalling slur. And where this leads is, if these slurs become mainstream, it ends up in what we saw on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January last year. So this is a time to get angry. This isn't a time to just, debate the niceties of did he, didn't he. Call this out. It's a slur and it's wrong, and it should be seen as such, and there should be no dubiety. And I'm afraid seeing minister after minister defend this guy is really quite distressing, and people should be very, very worried about it.
Right. Well, is that you? Is that who he's talking about amongst ministers?
Well, I'm certainly not a minister. But what I'd say is, on this programme today, I have set out the facts as contained in the independent report that Keir Starmer
so
commissioned.
you are still sticking, even though we've had a discussion about the fact that what he said precisely, what Boris Johnson said precisely is not true. It is a false claim.
So I think Fact Check said that is open to interpretation.
Are you buying into what Brendan has just set out, which is, in his words, a Trumpian style of politics?
No, I don't accept that. I've set out the facts. Let's deal in the facts as we know about them.
Well, hang on.
And I go back to the point. If he had nothing to apologise for, even on behalf of his organisation, even though I accept he is proven in that report he had no direct involvement in this case, if he had nothing to apologise for, why did he apologise? The British public will make their mind up on that, but they are the facts. I'm not hiding behind parliamentary privilege. They are the facts. They failed to prosecute him. He was in charge. He apologised correctly, in my view.
I'm sad to see Jake is not Johnson. And I'm sorry for raising my voice earlier. I'm just very upset about trust in our institutions, because whichever political party we're in, if the public lose trust in vital institutions, whether the police or the CPS or Parliament, then we're really in trouble. And on that issue of trust in institutions, something that I've become very worried about in recent weeks is the relationship between the leadership of the Metropolitan Police and the leadership of the government. I've been calling for a statutory public inquiry into the matters arising from the murder of Sarah Everard and the broader issues of cultural issues in the police. And I've been calling that for many months. And of course, the Metropolitan Commissioner has been resisting, but so, I'm afraid, is the Home Secretary. And I was going, why doesn't the government do this? Why doesn't the government have a proper statutory inquiry? This is backed by Nuala alone, who did the Daniel Morgan inquiry and was hampered without having powers to compel evidence. And so why is the government not doing this? It's a no-brainer for rebuilding public trust. And now, of course, number 10 is being investigated by the police. So they're all hugging each other close, and it's not great for law and order, and it's not great for trust in our vital institutions.
Well, as you bring up the issue of trust in our institution, it has been a bad week, I think, by everyone's judgment, for the Metropolitan Police. An investigation into Metropolitan Police officers uncovers racism, misogyny, harassment and offensive social media messages found by the police watchdog. They've condemned Scotland Yard officers. It centres largely on Charing Cross Police Station. Emma Barnett on BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour read out some of the WhatsApp exchanges that have been revealed, and just to warn you, they are graphic and shocking.
One male officer wrote to a female officer on message saying, "I would happily rape you. If I was single, I would happily chloroform you." Another two officers engaged in this exchange. "Grab her by the you ever slapped your missus? It makes them love you more. Seriously, since I did that, she won't leave me alone." Another one says, "My dad kidnapped some African children and used them to make dog food."
Mo, you were Special Advisor to former Home Secretary Amber Rudd. Is the Metropolitan Police fit for service? For purpose, I should say.
I think when you look at the series of messages we've just seen, we've seen the Sarah Everard case, other issues that it's facing right now, I think that question is the right question to be asked. I think it falls short of being fit for service at the moment, and the whole culture of what we are seeing and hearing in the leadership does need to be looked at. Again, because these are the people that you go to, you should trust in time of need, in time of help. You should be able to rely on them. And if that's not happening, and if there is distrust amongst the public, that is damaging for the long term, and that needs to be addressed.
Right, and should Cressida Dick go, the head of the Metropolitan Police now?
I don't think she's the right person going forward to lead that organisation.
Do you think she should go?
I'm really sorry to say this, because it's not in my nature to run around calling for resignations, but the reason why I do think she needs to go is because she's been doubling down. She's been resisting the statutory inquiry. She's been hubristic. She's been tin-eared. It's not just, she's not personally responsible for what happened to Sarah Everard, but she is responsible for the policing of the vigil that followed. And she doubles down. She resists external scrutiny. And of course, now the government's not offering independent scrutiny because it's facing investigation by the Met Police. This is a shocking state of affairs. We need to do something about it.
Do you think she should go, Jake?
Look, I actually feel physically sick listening to those messages being read out. I didn't think there was much left in the world that could shock me Cressida Dick is responsible for the culture. She either comes forward with a plan to fix this or ships out and lets someone else who has the plan change the culture of the police. That, wherever you're from, whatever side of the political divide you sit on, is disgusting, it's unacceptable, and we have to change the culture of our police.
Jake, do you agree with me that we need a full statutory inquiry? This is supported by Helen Newlove, who's in your party.
Well, look, I know there are calls for that. I don't know if now is the right time to do it, but what I would say is that the vast majority of police officers in this country will be as disgusted as we are with this behaviour. Right. Our police do a great job, and we should support them in the very difficult work that they do.
Just to let you know, there will be an urgent question on this report from the Independent Office for Police Conduct, calling for a statement on precisely what is inside that report, some of which you have heard. Let's dip into the chamber. Prime Minister's Questions is coming up in just about 5 minutes' time. You can see it is filling up there inside the chamber in the House of Commons. We can talk to Tom Hunt, Conservative MP, who is standing in Central Lobby waiting to go into the chamber. Pressure still on the Prime Minister, Tom. He's back today at the dispatch box in the hot seat, having arrived back from Ukraine, part of the government's reset. Meanwhile, Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the Conservative MP, has submitted a letter of no confidence. He announced that this morning. Your reaction?
Well, that's for him to come to his own decision about what he thinks he should do, and he's decided to put in a letter of no confidence. I don't agree with him. That's not what I would be doing. That isn't to say I don't have significant concerns, but I do. But at this moment in time, I think the Prime Minister needs to be given space to reset and to focus on the country's priorities, and actually be interesting at PMQs if we could hear a little bit about what he got up to in Ukraine. It'd also be interesting to hear about cost of living. It'd be interesting to see those sorts of things debated. And actually, when I was in my constituency on Saturday, there was many of my constituents who were very angry about renovations over the last few weeks and months, but they were also determined and they want to see the government focused on their priorities.
Right, but part of the reason we're talking to you, Tom, is because you issued a lengthy message on Facebook yesterday. It was very lengthy, but I pulled out some of the extracts for it. You said that the parties, the events at Downing Street, that none of this is acceptable, excusable or defensible. In fact, you sound pretty angry in this message. You're not a sycophant.
I'm definitely not a sycophant, as you can see, but I think that this is, what happened in Number 10, these parties, this is a place where the laws of the country are created. There's a huge obligation on them to follow those rules, and myself, and talk about cut through, yes, it's cut through with the public, it's cut through with me. I'm very angry about it, but at the same time, we need to, we can all get angry about it, but the question is, what is the proportionate step to take? And at this particular moment in time, I think it would be disproportionate to start calling for a Prime Minister to resign. Right,
but is he on notice in your mind?
I wouldn't say he's on notice. He's just got back from Ukraine. He's doing his job. I mean, obviously there's further developments. I had hoped that this Sue Gray report would have drawn a line under it and it would have been a full report, but because of the Metropolitan Police, this will be dragging on for weeks more, which is regrettable. It's regrettable.
But I mean, if you're angry and the Sue Gray report hasn't drawn a line under it because it's only a partial report, some of her findings, actually things are going in the opposite direction for the Prime Minister. It's not just Tobias Ellwood. Your Conservative colleague Peter Aldous has also called on the Prime Minister to resign. I presume you know him because he's a neighbouring constituency MP.
Well, I think, is it sort of 10 or 11 Conservative MPs have called for a Prime Minister to resign? There's about 360 Conservative MPs in total, so that is a pretty small fraction.
Yeah,
Look,
but they're the ones we know. They're the ones we know about, of course, and it's 54 letters that have to go in to trigger a leadership contest. I mean, would you say it's going well for the Prime Minister?
Well, it's been an incredibly difficult 2 months. It's been a really awful 2 months in terms of all the things that have been coming to the fore. It's been distracting the focus of government, which is why I want to go into PMQs and hear about the real priorities for my constituents, which is cost of living, getting beyond COVID and hearing about who the Prime Minister's been up to in Ukraine. Look, there's going to be more developments in the Metropolitan Police investigation, and I don't know what that's going to come up with.
Yeah.
But at this particular moment in time, I think it would be disproportionate to start calling for a Prime Minister to resign.
Tom, stay with us if you can, just for a minute more. Jake, listening to that, as we said, we've had more of your colleagues putting in letters, calling for the Prime Minister to go. What does he have to do today at PMQs?
Well, it always helps if a Prime Minister puts a good performance in. In the last couple of weeks, I think the Prime Minister has been very good at PMQs, reminding Conservative colleagues actually that on the big calls, whether it's Ukraine, you know, coming out of the COVID restrictions, or even getting Brexit done, historic though that is now, that he's got it right. So colleagues will be looking to him for a good performance. I think we will see one today, but also he came to the 1922 committee on Monday of this week. To that committee, he said he wants the opportunity to reset his premiership, to make changes in Downing Street and get back onto those people's priorities of reducing crime, improving the economy, delivering levelling up, and that's what colleagues want to see.
What do you make of the timing then of Tobias Ellwood, chair of the Defence Select Committee, as the Prime Minister returns from Ukraine, putting in a letter of no confidence?
Well, it's that. I mean, that's a matter of. I think it's. You know, I think it's poor timing, given that the Prime Minister has just been in the Ukraine, dealing with a huge defence crisis potentially for the United Kingdom, and it's a time where you want the Defence Secretary, the Chairman of the Defence Select Committee, and the Prime Minister to work together. You'd have to ask Tobias Ellwood that. I'm just saying, I think the timing is poor, but it's a matter for him.
How much trouble is the Prime Minister still in?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister is definitely not out of the woods yet. The longer these reports go on, in one way, it buys himself some more time to do the more domestic agenda, do more international agenda stuff. But equally, more drip can come out of revelations, questions around parties in the flat that are not being answered properly. I think that is damaging. With the spectre of May elections coming up as well, MPs, whether they say it publicly or not, I think will be concerned, and they will be looking ahead to what more is there to come in this report.
Is it worth waiting to hear the findings of the Metropolitan Police report?
Well, one of the things I'm concerned about is the timing. Because the Metropolitan Police could have investigated long before Sue Gray was even called in. There were police officers outside number 10, inside number 10. Why did they only come in once Sue Gray was about to report? Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but you know, if I feel like that, how are people in the country feeling? I do think that this is a really serious issue. It's not trivial, these parties. It's one law for some and another law for others. So many people made such sacrifices, and the lawmakers should not be lawbreakers.
Has it bought him time, Helen?
Bought him a bit of time, hasn't it? But I really think that Partygate has got great cut through, and it's going to linger in the memory, of course, for the May local elections, but then the general election, even if that's in 3 years' time. So I think it's a real sort of blot against his reputation that will be indelible.
Tom, just before we go to Prime Minister's questions, there are reports of other parties that the Prime Minister has supposedly attended. Do you think it'll ever end, really?
Well, I think there's a good chance that it will end and we can draw a line under it once this Metropolitan Police investigation has been completed. Regrettably, as I said earlier, because of the nature of what's happened last week, it is going to drag on for a few more weeks, and it's very disappointing that we're not be able to draw a line under it. But ultimately, when it comes to the next general election, I do think, actually, for most people, it's going to be things like how a Prime Minister dealt with COVID, what's the economy looking like, did he address the cost of living concerns, did he deal with things like illegal immigration, which is a major priority for my constituents. Those are the things that are coming up on the doorstep on Saturday. That isn't to downplay the anger there is. It's not to downplay the anger there is. This is about what is the proportionate step to take at this moment in time. For me, it would be disproportionate to call for a Prime Minister's resignation.
Tom Hunt, thank you very much. I'm going to say thank you and goodbye to all of our guests for today, because I think we can cross into the chamber. The Speaker is about to announce the start of Prime Minister's questions. It has filled up as expected. Of course, it's been a packed chamber over the last few weeks. Let's just dip in and hear what the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, is saying.
Such a substantive motion is under consideration. Erskine May is clear that it is to preserve the character of parliamentary debate, which I take to mean to stop it descending into fruitless cycles of accusation and counter-accusation. May I also say that expressions, when used in respect of the members, which are regarded with particular seriousness, generally leading to prompt intervention from the Chair and often a requirement on a member to withdraw the words, include charges uttering deliberate falsehoods. It is important to stress context. Similar words said in different proceedings might attract a different response from the Chair, depending on the subject being debated, tone and other considerations, but in general the Chair will not tolerate accusations of lying or deliberately misleading the House. That is the long-standing practice of the House, as set out in Erskine May and followed by successive speakers and deputy speakers. Of course, long-standing
Just to inform our viewers and guests what is happening, Lindsay Hoyle is going through quite a lengthy explanation of the rules in the House of Commons and the way that honourable members should address each other. This, of course, is following on from what we were discussing earlier on Politics Live, which was the language that Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, was using, probably also referring, even if it was under parliamentary privilege, the language and accusation that was levelled at Keir Starmer by Boris Johnson. I should think Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, has come in for some criticism and probably also support on both sides. So he is reading Erskine May, the Bible, if you like, on these kinds of things. He's now calling the first question.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday, Her Majesty the Queen will become the first British monarch to celebrate a Platinum Jubilee. While it is a moment for national celebration, it will be a day of mixed emotions for Her Majesty, as, of course, the day also marks 70 years since the death of her beloved father, George VI. I know that the whole House will want to join me in thanking Her Majesty for her tireless service. We look forward to celebrating her historic reign with a series of national events in June. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. McVeigh.
On Monday, the Secretary of State for Health said mandatory vaccinations would be subject to a consultation. So can the Prime Minister make it clear, unequivocally, no ifs, no buts, no qualifications, that mandatory vaccinations for NHS staff will be abandoned? Will he also make it clear that is true for care workers as well, many of whom have already lost their jobs? So what support will the government be giving to get those care workers back into the care sector, and will those who've lost their jobs get compensation?
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for her thoughtful work on this. I want to stress that vaccines remain our best line of defence, and I do think that NHS staff and all those who work in the care sector have a professional responsibility to get vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. But as my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, told the House on Monday, given the difference between Omicron and Delta, it is right, and she is right, that we revisit the balance of risks and opportunities, Mr. Speaker. The Health Secretary has said we'll launch a consultation, and subject to the responses and the will of this House, Mr. Speaker, the government will revoke the regulations.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following your opening remarks, I just want to say to the members opposite, theirs is the party of Winston Churchill. Our parties stood together as we defeated fascism in Europe. Now their leader stands in the House of Commons parroting the conspiracy theories of violent fascists to try and score cheap political points. He knows exactly what he is doing. It's time to restore some dignity. Mr. Speaker, one of the most absurd claims made on behalf of Operation Save Big Dog is the Prime Minister and the Chancellor writing in the Sunday Times that they are the tax-cutting Conservatives. Why do these alleged tax cutters keep raising taxes on working people?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on his first point, I don't want to make heavy weather of this, but I am informed that in 2013, the right honourable gentleman apologised and took full responsibility for what had happened on his watch. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that was the right thing to do. And Mr. Speaker, On what we're doing to tackle cost of living and taxation, Mr. Speaker, our COVID recovery plan is absolutely vital in helping people with the cost of living, lifting up universal credit payments, Mr. Speaker, by cutting the tax that people effectively pay, lifting the living wage, Mr. Speaker, helping councils with another £500 million for those who are facing particular hardship, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing, and this is absolutely vital, is increasing the number of high-wage, high-skill jobs in this country. 420,000 more on the payroll than there were before the pandemic began, because we've had the fastest exit from COVID of any European economy, Mr. Speaker, because we had the fastest vaccine and booster rollout.
Keir Starmer. Mr. Speaker, it's not just the national insurance rise. Thresholds for income tax frozen. A stealth tax on working people. The threshold for tuition fees frozen. A stealth tax on working people. Local authorities forced to increase council tax. A stealth tax on working people. You can be as stealthy as you like, but you can't hide reality. We have the highest tax burden for 70 years during the middle of an inflation crisis. So I ask the Prime Minister again, why do he and the Chancellor keep raising taxes on working people?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is helping people with the cost of living, cutting taxes for those on universal credit, Mr. Speaker, as I have said. Helping people with the cost of their fuel, Mr. Speaker, with the cold weather payments, the warm homes payments, Mr. Speaker, doing all the things that this country would expect, lifting the living wage, which this party, Mr. Speaker, introduced. This government has increased by the record amount, Mr. Speaker. And above all, the most important thing that we are doing is helping people into work. 500,000 people off welfare into work under our Way to Work scheme. More people in work now than before the pandemic began, and that is the record of this government. Labour, never forget, Mr. Speaker, there's never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when they entered. Check that out,
Mr. Speaker. Lots of words, lots of bluster, no answers. Word of warning. Word of warning, Prime Minister. That's not going to work with the police. I'll tell him why they're putting taxes up. Low growth. In the decade of Tory government before the pandemic, growth slumped. It was much, much weaker than under the last Labour government. If the Tories matched our record on growth, we would have £30 billion more to spend on public services without having to raise a single tax. Mr. Speaker, surely even this Prime Minister doesn't need someone else to tell him that he and the Chancellor are having to raise taxes because the Tories failed to grow the economy over a decade.
No, Mr. Speaker, I think everybody in this country can see that we've been through the biggest pandemic since for 100 years, that we've looked after the people of this country to the tune of £400 billion, that we've put into furlough and all the other schemes, 11.7 million people protected. Everybody knows the cost of that, Mr. Speaker. And at the same time, in spite of all the difficulties that we have faced, we have now got the fastest growth in the G7. Absolutely true. We've got youth unemployment. We've got youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker. We've got 3 times as much tech investment coming into this country as there is in France, twice as much as there is in Germany. Yes, that's absolutely true, Mr. Speaker. And never forget, if you want to know about Labour economics, never forget the last time they were in office, Mr. Speaker, when they were finally booted out, they left a note saying there's no money left. That's the way they run the country, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer. Mr. Speaker, the UK...
Some people won't be getting more because they won't be here to hear it, so Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the UK has suffered the worst economic crisis in the G7. The Prime Minister has more chance of persuading the public that he didn't hold any parties than he has of persuading them that the economy is booming. High taxes are not just the result of low growth. Under this government, we've seen a pandemic of waste and fraud. From the Prime Minister's yacht to government contracts for mates of ministers, they've treated taxpayers as an ATM machine for their mates and their lifestyles. Now we find, Mr. Speaker, they've written off £8.7 billion on PPA, and the Chancellor's writing off £4.3 billion in fraud. That's enough to cover the tax hike he's inflicting on working people. So why did this government block the National Crime Agency from investigating all the billions they lost to fraud?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course we despise fraud and those who steal from the taxpayer, and that's why we've already recovered £743 million in lost furlough money, Mr. Speaker, £2.2 billion that was stolen in bounce-back loans, and we will go on. But I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I am proud of what this government and this country did in securing record quantities of PPE and record time, Mr. Speaker, in furloughing and looking after the entirety of British business and society in the way that we did, Mr. Speaker. And once again, Captain Hindsight comes to this House and attacks the government for doing exactly what he urged us to do 18 months ago. Mr. Speaker, it so happens that I found a letter. I've been rustling in my notes, Mr. Speaker, and I found a letter which I will place for your convenience in the House, in the library of the House, Mr. Speaker, from the Shadow Chancellor to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Deluxe, suggesting that we could secure PPE supplies. This is on April the 22nd, 2020. Secure PPE supplies from from a theatrical costumier, and that we could get ventilators from a professional football agent, Mr. Speaker. No wonder under Labour, fraud was running at £21 billion per year, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud of what this government did to secure PPE, and I'm proud of the way we protected this country.
Keir Starmer. Who wants to be the first to leave? Please put your hand up, because I'm going to pick one of you. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister might want to sharpen how he answers questions under interview. He's going to need it in the next few weeks. Waste and low growth explain why we have high taxes, but they don't explain why it's always working people that are asked to pay more. Yesterday, he ordered his troops not to support a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. As a result, the country is missing out on over £1 billion we could have used to cut taxes on energy bills for working people. Today, he's ordering his troops to vote for tax cuts for banks. As a result, the country is missing out on another £1 billion we could have spent cutting taxes for working people. Why are the Chancellor and the Prime Minister protecting oil companies and bank profits while putting taxes up on working people?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, let's just get to the heart of what this is all about. This is all about dealing with the consequences of the biggest pandemic this country has seen, with an unprecedented economic crisis in which the state had to come forward and look after the people of this country to the tune of £408 billion. Everybody can see the fiscal impacts of that. Shall I tell you what this government and this country is voting for and what we're doing? We're investing now in 45,000 more NHS workers, more people in our NHS this year than there were last year. 10,000 more nurses, 10,900 more nurses, about 5,000 more doctors, Mr. Speaker, 9 million more scans, 100 community diagnostics hubs to help people to get the scans and treatment they need. And the incredible thing, the lamentable thing is that the party opposite, the party of Nye Bevan, Mr. Speaker, voted against those funds, voted against that investment, and they would have made our COVID recovery impossible.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, for all the bluster, the truth is the Conservative Party are the party of high taxes because they're the party of low growth. They are the party of high taxes because they're the party of eye-watering waste. Mr. Speaker, we know this Prime Minister has no respect for decency or honesty. I can take it. I can take it when it's aimed at me, but I won't accept it when he gaslights the British public, writing absurd articles about cutting taxes at a time when he's squeezing working people to the pips. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that he and his Chancellor are the Tory Thelma and Louise, hand in hand, as they drive the country off the cliff and into the abyss of low growth and high tax?
Mr Gullis, I think you've been trilled for long enough and you don't want to be trilled anymore. And that is the last comment I have, or otherwise I will ring your mother. Keir Starmer.
Isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that he and the Chancellor are the Tory Thelma and Louise, hand in hand as they drive the country off the cliff and into the abyss of low growth and high tax?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman is Dick Dastardly and Muttley. Both of them pulling in different directions. We know they have different views, Mr. Speaker. We are getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker. And just in the last few days, and of course, I think it's absolutely extraordinary that they've done nothing to support our COVID recovery plan. They've voted against our plans to support the NHS. But what we're doing, just in the last few days, while he's been fixated on the issues that he's absolutely determined to escalate, what we've done, we've opened free ports across the country just in the last few days. We're getting 500,000 people off welfare into work with our Way to Work plan. In just a few short minutes, Mr. Speaker, I hope he will hang around, because he will hear my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, deliver the long-awaited Levelling Up white paper, full of good stuff, including 55 education investment areas across our country. A wonderful moral and economic mission to level up and give opportunity across the whole country. A fantastic vision for this country, Mr. Speaker. They have nothing of the kind to offer the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, while we are getting on with coming out of COVID with the fastest economic recovery in the G7, the fastest. He would have kept us in lockdown, Mr. Speaker. We're fixing the NHS. We're fixing the NHS and social care when they voted against it, and they have no plan. And we are, well, Mr. Speaker, we are building a coalition.
Order.
We are building a coalition.
Just a minute. Prime Minister, I'm this way, not that way. Maybe Specsavers might be the answer to see where I am. And can I just say, Dame Caroline Dinage is desperate to get the next question to you. Dame Diana Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, first of all, give my condolences to the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham and say how good it is to see her back in her place. Mr. Speaker, Sophie Farrell was just 10 years old when she died in September. Childhood cancer is often described as rare, yet cancer is the biggest killer of children under 14. Sophie's GP failed to diagnose her cancer, and it was only when she went to A&E that they discovered the tumour in her little body that was 12 centimetres long. So, Mr. Speaker, on World Cancer Day on Friday, I would like to ask the Prime Minister to please advocate for more and better training for general practice to identify cancer in children.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable. I'm very sorry to hear of Sophie's case, and my thoughts are with her family and her friends. And she's right that research is crucial in tackling childhood cancers. That's why we're investing in more research. But it's also vital that we do tests and diagnostic scans and screens early enough. And that's why it's also important that NICE has not only updated its guidance on referring childhood cancers in February February last year, but we're investing in 100 new diagnostic centres in community hubs.
I now come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that you and the rest of the House will want to join me in celebrating and supporting World Cancer Day. Mr. Speaker, just in relation to your earlier statement, I have a difficulty reconciling the Prime Minister's version of events with other evidence, and as you know, I have a duty to reflect and represent the deep, deep public anger with the Prime Minister. That said, Mr. Speaker, I respect the absolute impartiality that you take in your role, and I want to set on the record that I respect both you and the authority of the Chair. Mr. Speaker, this morning the Telegraph newspaper revealed that the Prime Minister attended a party in his flat on the 13th of November 2020. The Prime Minister previously told the House that no party took place. The police are now investigating this party, and we face a very real prospect of a sitting Prime Minister being questioned under caution and being fined in office. And if he is questioned, Mr. Speaker, he must go. If he's fined, he must resign. Mr. Speaker, you'll agree that the House should not be treated with contempt. So can the Prime Minister... here we go again. So can the Prime Minister update the House on his whereabouts on the evening of the 13th of November? Surely, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't need to wait for an investigation to tell us exactly where he was.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we go again, says the right honourable gentleman opposite, and I must say those are entirely my feelings. He asked exactly the same questions as I recall in the chamber a few days ago. He knows, Mr. Speaker, that the process must go on, but I can tell him what's been going on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker. In November and throughout, we've been delivering the fastest vaccine and booster rollout anywhere in Europe. We've been getting people back into work, Mr. Speaker. We've been getting people back into work, Mr. Speaker, and we've been helping to bring the West together to defy what I think is completely unacceptable threats and intimidation from the Putin regime against Ukraine. And that's what we've been doing.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, that was a disgraceful response. And I have to say to the Prime Minister, he should read the room and he should see some of the faces on his colleagues' faces. He has lost it. Mr. Speaker, we've now reached the ridiculous scenario of a Prime Minister who can't even tell us where he was. He lives in a world where he thinks everything is owed to him, and he never pauses to think what he owes to the public. The Prime Minister is now a dangerous distraction at home and a running joke on the international stage. What does it tell the Prime Minister and the public that in the morning that he has returned from Ukraine, the chair of the Defence Select Committee has submitted a letter of no confidence in him?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what it tells me that it is more vital than ever for the government of this country to get on with the job, deliver our COVID recovery plan, and that is what we are doing.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to say thank you to the Prime Minister for visiting my Unismore constituency, where he saw firsthand the enormous beneficial impact a new nuclear plant will know it could have if built on Anglesey. Nuclear power must play a role if we are to meet our carbon and net zero commitments, level up and combat rising energy prices. Does my right honourable friend agree that the rapid deployment of nuclear technology must be a priority for this government? And if so, will my right honourable friend commit to financing a nuclear plant at the Wilver site this Parliament?
Well, it was a great joy to visit my honourable friend's constituency, where I believe she is known as Atomic Kitten, or so she informed me, Mr. Speaker, and she outlined in great detail her plans for Wilfer. It's a fantastic vision, a fantastic site, and it remains a very interesting and attractive prospect for new nuclear power.
Colin Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if the Prime Minister has noticed, but while he's been partying, working families in Northern Ireland have lost £1,000 from their universal credit. Their national insurance has been put up by this government, and their energy bills are going through the roof. He's very fond of telling us that we're all in this together. Isn't it the truth, Mr. Speaker, that this Prime Minister has only ever been in it for himself and his rich mates?
No, Mr. Speaker, I'm in it to serve my country and the entire United Kingdom. And I'm also proud that we've had the biggest investment in Northern Ireland since devolution began, and we've cut taxation on universal credit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Western Railway has totally cut off Dorset, Somerset, most of Wiltshire and Devon from its direct rail services to London, as well as slashing our service in half, most of which is totally unnecessary. Will my right honourable friends support me and my neighbouring colleagues in getting direct services back to West Dorset and having a timetable that's fit for our region?
Prime Minister. I want to thank my honourable friend very much for his question, and he knows whereof he speaks. He's an expert in this subject, Mr. Speaker, and he's lobbied very effectively for his constituents and reflected their frustrations. And I'm told that the timetable is expected to return to December 2021 levels from Saturday, the 19th of February.
Alex Sherbel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was out this weekend speaking to a constituent who has a cold and leaky house. She has seen her bills already go up from £100 to £170 a month. The government have failed to insulate her house and failed to control her fuel bills. Bribing people with their own money is no plan. The Prime Minister has no plan to cut VAT, no plan to get the oil and gas industry to contribute. Another constituent who voted for the Prime Minister went further and called him despicable. What use is a Prime Minister who has no plan for families struggling with the cost of living and has lost the trust of the people of this country?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about cutting VAT. I wonder whether he voted for Brexit and our ability to cut VAT. Perhaps he could indicate. Perhaps he could indicate, Mr. Speaker, what we're doing, which we delivered, Mr. Speaker, and whose anniversary we celebrated on Monday. And what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is, and I sympathise very much with his constituent, and I understand the pressures that people are facing on the cost of living. But what we've got to do is invest in and then protect them, and we're putting £12 billion worth of support and financial help for families in hardship this year, and it's absolutely vital after the pandemic. But the most important thing is to have a jobs-led economic recovery. And in case I failed to make myself clear before you wound me up, Mr. Speaker, that's why we have the fastest economic growth in the G7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Greater Manchester Mayoral Clean Air Zone scheme, effectively a congestion charge affecting all 500 square miles of Greater Manchester, including my constituents in Lee, is a job-destroying tax on ordinary working people. We all want clean air, but the model proposed by Mayor Burnham is unworkable and economically devastating. With charges of £60 per day per lorry driver. Taxis, white van men, even buses will be caught by it. Will the PM intervene to prevent Mayor Burnham from inflicting this disastrous Labour scheme on Greater Manchester?
I know from my own experience how vital it is when you're trying to clean up air in a great city that you do not unjustly penalise business, and particularly small businesses. And it's become clear that the scheme proposed by the Labour Mayor in Manchester is completely unworkable, will do more damage to businesses and residents in Manchester. So we must find an alternative, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't punish local residents. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, will be saying more about this in the coming days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister receives a penalty fixed notice for attending a party or hosting a party during lockdown, will he inform the House and will he resign?
Yes. Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course I will comply with the law, but I've got to wait for the process to be concluded.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since being
President, my fabulous constituency of Blythe Valley is really seeing the green shoots of prosperity. Government support is a green revolution in Blythe Valley. However, with such growth, the increased congestion on our roads, we are in desperate need of upgrades to the road infrastructure. Would my right honourable friend please meet with me to discuss the urgent problem and help Blythe Valley out of the ever-increasing traffic jam? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is the best champion that Blythe could possibly have. And he does a quite amazing job. And I want to thank him in particular, Mr. Speaker, for helping to secure the British Volt Gigafactory in Blythe. Absolutely amazing investment. And I understand that, of course, growth and prosperity bring their challenges when it comes to congestion on our roads. We have to tackle that. We're working with the Council on a bid for the Blythe Relief Road, and I'll make sure that my honourable friend gets a meeting with the Transport Secretary to discuss it further.
Rachel Bascom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with a distracted Prime Minister is that he makes the wrong choices. While he's been living it up, many of my constituents are living on the breadline as food, energy and taxes shoot up. In York, the rent prices are the highest now in the north and some of the highest in the country. And York is now in the top 10 places in the country where there is a cost of living crisis, pushing my constituents further into poverty and debt. So when is he going to stop protecting himself and start protecting my constituents?
So, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things I did when I became Prime Minister was to ensure that we looked after people on low incomes by increasing local housing allowance, Mr. Speaker, by increasing the living wage, not once but twice, and by record amounts, Mr. Speaker, and of course by doing what we've now done with universal credit. But the most important, I really think the House needs to get this, but the most important thing about the UK economy right now is that we have a strong jobs-led recovery, and that is what is going to drive up wages and drive up productivity and drive up growth, and that is what this government is delivering.
Sir Desmond Swain. Will he brief us on his visit to Ukraine? Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend very much, and in very briefly, Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House that the mission was to, as I hope everybody will support, was to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, for the House, for our country to show that we stand with the people of Ukraine and we stand for the sovereign and territorial integrity of Ukraine at a very difficult time, because there are on the borders of Ukraine, as everybody knows, about 125,000 Russian troops massing. The situation is very perilous. And the job of the UK is to lead the West in bringing together the most important countries in creating a package of economic sanctions that will deter President Putin from what I believe would be a disastrous miscalculation, and also to strengthen our support for the Ukrainian people and indeed the Ukrainian army. And we're doing that. We're supplying lethal but defensive weaponry as well as training to the Ukrainians. And that is greatly appreciated. But I must say that the situation remains risky, Mr. Speaker, and it is vital that diplomacy finds a way forward.
Thomas.
Mr. Speaker, on a related issue, after the publication of the Russia report, the Prime Minister claimed tackling illicit finance and driving dirty money and money launderers out of the UK is a priority. His warnings to Mr. Putin of late would surely have carried more bite if he'd actually used the 18 months since publication of the Russia report to legislate for an economic crime act to stop the flow of dirty money for Russia. Why hasn't he prioritised this issue of national security?
Mr. Speaker, contrary to some of the myths that are peddled, this government has come down very hard on dirty money from Russia and everywhere else. That's why we brought in the unexplained wealth orders and indeed China, Mr. Speaker, which they might like to consider. That's why we have sanctions on Russia following what they did in Crimea in 2014. We have Magnitsky sanctions on everybody involved in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. And to his point, Mr. Speaker, we are bringing forward the economic crime bill so that it will take place, it will be voted on in the third session of this Parliament.
We're leaving Prime Minister's questions at this point. Of course, if anything important develops, we will bring it to you straight away. Let me introduce our guest for this part of the programme. For the government, Neil O'Brien, Levelling Up Minister. Obviously very timely today as we expect that statement from Michael Gove on precisely that, levelling up. Steve Reid for the Labour Party, Shadow Justice Secretary, and also Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. Well, it was a lively and noisy Prime Minister's questions, but it actually started with the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, giving MPs a lesson in parliamentary language and what they can and they cannot say to each other, and they can't say that members lie or mislead the House. This follows on from the SNP leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford, doing exactly that on Monday. There were also comments made by Boris Johnson during that same session about Keir Starmer's time as the Director of Public Prosecutions. There's been a backlash to that, where he said he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out. There was a response from Keir Starmer to that right at the beginning. What did he say?
It was interesting, Jo, because Keir Starmer took this actually head on, because he's actually, I think, in the last few years has deliberately never given these claims any wind, any attention, because they are so controversial. And as you've talked about in the first half of the programme also, there is no evidence to say that Keir Starmer himself had anything to do personally with prosecutions of Jimmy Savile going ahead. So to get that out there, there was no evidence for that. But it was interesting that he chose to accuse the Prime Minister of peddling far-right conspiracy theories that had been doing the rounds in the dark corners of the internet. Interesting then that the Prime Minister chose to repeat his claim, but in less colourful language than he did on Monday. So he made a slightly different point, referring to what is also a fact, that Keir Starmer, as Director of Public Prosecutions, made a general apology for the organisation's failure to prosecute Mr Savile. That, of course, is not the same thing as answering a charge that he had any personal involvement with the decisions not to go ahead with prosecutions in what we know now, of course, were such terrible cases. But I think what's interesting is that there are Conservative MPs, some of them publicly, who have been calling for Boris Johnson to withdraw the claim that he made on Monday. Also a lawyer for some of the Savile victims who we spoke to on BBC News yesterday, who said the victims had been appalled and upset by the Prime Minister referencing their experiences at all by dragging them into the political arena. Boris Johnson chose not to withdraw those claims and instead to repeat that general fact that Keir Starmer did make an apology for the CPS's failings, but not for anything because he was not personally involved.
Right. And actually, before we move on and I talk to our other guests, Tobias Ellwood, something we also spoke about just before Prime Minister's questions, is the latest Conservative MP and chair of the Defence Select Committee to call for the Prime Minister to go, or at least trigger some sort of contest. I think he actually wants the Prime Minister himself to actually instigate that contest. But he referenced these comments that we've just talked about, and we can hear him here.
We've had how many weeks, indeed months, to show repair, to actually introduce the changes that will actually affect our ability to communicate with the nation, to actually improve the decision-making in Number 10. And yet here we have Jimmy Savile mentioned in the very, very debate that's the response to the Sue Gray report. That's not showing the contrition I think the nation want to see. It's absolutely right that we praise the Prime Minister with his energy and enthusiasm that got us up to this point. But the domestic and international challenges, I think, now require a new leader, and that's why I've submitted a letter.
Pretty damning, Neil.
Well, I think the Prime Minister in PMQ's talked about his recent mission to the Ukraine, where we're on the edge of a really serious military conflict, potentially Russian invasion of Eastern Europe and the first state-on-state war in Europe since 1945. So this is a really serious moment. And for that reason, amongst others, that's why I don't agree with my colleague Tobias, even though I have a huge amount of respect and time for Tobias, and we've worked together on lots of different subjects. I take a different view. The PM is right to be focusing on this very, very serious military threat that we've got in Eastern Europe, and indeed on the economic challenges which he was setting out at PMQs today. I thought the Prime Minister had his best week at PMQs for several weeks, and that was because
could have been quite low,
and that was because we were talking about the economy. And when you're talking about the economy, Keir Starmer's fundamental argument is, I can spend more on every single thing, but taxes will be lower, right? You can believe that, but if you believe that, honestly, you're a mug, and no one, I don't think, out there will really believe that. The government is taking tough choices, right? We have raise tax. It's an extremely painful decision for us as Conservatives.
Highest tax taken 70 years.
Correct, it is.
From a Conservative government.
And the reason we have taken that painful decision, is that we want to invest in the NHS to clear those backlogs, right? That is why we were able to invest an extra 15 billion in the NHS. And anyone who tells you that you can spend more on everything and no one will pay any more tax is treating you like a fool. And let's be clear, that tax is falling mainly on those who can afford it most. 15%, the top 15% of earners are paying 50% of the money. 6 million people will pay no extra result, and at the same time, we're putting £1,000 extra in the pockets of people by cutting the UC
You've
taper rate.
listed pretty well the whole manifesto there.
Raising the national minimum wage. One final thing, the national living wage is going to go up to £9.50 in April. It's going to be one of the highest minimum wages anywhere in the developed world. So we are absolutely focused on the cost of living, and that is the number one issue, certainly for my constituents.
Are you taking the country for fools?
Well, the Prime Minister is, isn't he? I mean, it's a Prime Minister without dignity and without honour. And the reason that the country, 3 months now, we've been going through this fiasco about corruption, about breaking the lockdown rules, about parties, and we're still locked into this distraction because the Prime Minister needs the police to tell him whether he was at a party or not. Now, Neil would know if he was at a party. I would know if I was at a party. The Prime Minister cannot tell the truth, and so we are stuck with this huge distraction about lying and corruption. Now, what really matters to the British people is the economy. It's the cost of living. It is the cost of living crisis that you want the Prime Minister to focus on. He's not, because of his own misdemeanours, but that's what we should all be focusing on. And as Keir Starmer just said, we've had, under the Conservative, growth that has been so low that they have ended up having to hike up taxes to the highest level for 70 years. Right now, we've got the highest rate of inflation for 30 years. We've just gone through, in the last decade, has been the lowest for wage growth since the Great Depression in the 1930s. All of that is because they've failed on the economy. If they'd grown the economy at the same rate as the last Labour government did, they would have £30 billion more to spend without raising a penny of tax, and they've targeted working people for their tax hikes.
Unemployment doubled. We ended up with the biggest deficit in our entire peacetime history, which we had to clean up. You criticise us every step of the way. You never offered any support.
It's the tax hikes. The money you're getting from the tax hikes has been thrown down the drain.
With the biggest deficit in any of the
billion
economies. Because of the out-of-control spending under the last Labour government.
Let's talk about today, because there are still very serious allegations being levelled at you, not just by the opposition, but also by Conservative MPs who do not want to see that tax hike in April. It looks as if it is going ahead, but 1.25 percentage points at a time when Steve said inflation is running way above what it should be, 5.5% almost, and the highest tax take from Conservatives that we have seen for 70 years. How can you say that you've got the economy under control?
So being in government rather than opposition involves making difficult real-world decisions, and we decided that we wanted to fund the NHS properly and have decent social care for people. The other decision that we make today, is that we make major investments to level up this country. We're going to be publishing the Levelling Up white paper later on today. And that is the sort of thing that my constituents are very concerned about. And it will mark a distinct change from the approach that we had under the last Labour government in all kinds of ways. Under Labour, you had more and more of that growth-enhancing spending on things like research and development in the richest parts of the country. London, where you represent, Oxford and Cambridge, we're going to stop that.
Shall I tell you how much you're not
regeneration, you shut down English partnerships and shut down our major regeneration agency. We're going to get back into that.
Let's Steve respond to something.
Education is key to levelling this country up. You cannot get a high-skill, high-wage economy without education. Next year, spending on education will be 9% lower in real terms than 12 years ago when the Conservatives came into office. They are cutting education.
Spending is going up by £4 billion.
You're cutting education, just like you cut the NHS for things.
Hang on, I will let you in just a moment, but while you're trading statistics, just to be clear on the national insurance money, the tax hike, and where that money is going to be spent, the accusation to Labour is that you don't want to support billions of pounds going into the National Health Service in order to recover from the pandemic and also to meet the long waiting lists that have now grown.
It's very important that we put money back into the NHS after the Tories cut it for the last 12 years. Very important indeed. But that burden must be shared fairly. What the Tories are doing is they're imposing a tax on working people that wealthy people can avoid.
How would you pay for it?
Let me give you an example. If you are a landlord who's making money from renting out properties, you don't pay a penny more in taxes.
We're
But if
talking
you're
about
one of their
£36 billion.
if you're one of their tenants living in those properties, you get clobbered by the tax hikes. So they're clobbering working people. You can raise the money, Joe, but you don't have to always go back to hard-working people and clobber them at a time when you've also got record inflation, record energy price hikes, record price rises in the shops, and low wage growth.
On this specifically, we raised capital gains tax, a tax mainly paid by the rich. We introduced a new tax on private jets. We ended the abuses, the double Irish, sideways lotteries, all these things that went under Labour, such that hedge fund bosses were paying less tax than their cleaners. So I don't want to hear any lessons from Labour.
Why did you vote
about
yesterday
taxing
against the windfall tax on
and the share of income tax
point.
paid by the top 1% has gone up and up and up. So we have taxed those who are most able to pay
Right.
in order to make massive investments in regenerating parts of this country that have been left behind for years
We'll come
and
on
got
to the
further
levelling
behind
up.
under Labour. The gap between London and less, it's fine for London
Why
and
won't you
people
cut
like
VAT on
the gap between London and the rest get massively bigger under Labour.
Fascinating about this.
Well, it is this row over the economy, of course, in the middle of all of
Exactly.
this.
What is absolutely fascinating and really telling about this, and with respect to both of you being so passionate and getting hotter under the collar about all of this, is that the Conservative Party finds itself in a position of having to defend putting taxes up and having to defend becoming a Conservative government who will say to their, blue in the face, we are low taxers, in the article that Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson put at the weekend, saying we are Thatcherites, we'd love to have everybody paying as little tax as we possibly could, except in reality, for the reasons that the Minister has articulated, they've made decisions that have led to them presiding over a government that actually is high spending and high taxing. And there are many, many people in the Conservative Party who feel deeply uncomfortable about that. And that is one of the reasons why, coupled with the fact that lots of people at home are starting to feel the pinch, and that's only going one way for many families because of inflation, that the Labour Party has, for political reasons, quite obviously clocked onto this and thought, hang on, we can shift this debate onto the economy. We can both show that we are empathising with people in the country who find it difficult at the moment to make ends meet, and also keep poking away at the Conservatives who are uncomfortable about the economic direction of travel. And irrespective of the fiasco over parties, irrespective over questions about the Prime Minister's character that some Conservatives have, there is something also that's very unsettled in the mood of the Tory party, and that is about where they really are going in the direction of travel. What do they really stand for? And for lots of Conservatives who are mulling over what the best way forward is right now, this question of the economic direction is a really big part of the mix.
I don't think anyone in the Conservative Party is fooled by Keir Starmer saying week in, week out, spend more on this, spend more on that. You're not spending enough on this, you should be spending more on that. But then I'm going to cut your tax.
Against VAT rises?
Hang on.
Nobody is fooled by this. No one in the Conservative Party, no one out there watching
But
this
would you
programme.
accept,
No one thinks that you can do.
Would you accept, Neil, that there is unhappiness or at least worry amongst some of your colleagues who don't like what they see as the high tax agenda?
None of us, nobody wants to raise taxes. We have focused insofar as there are tax
worried.
increases, those on those on the richest. But you have to make tough choices. We prioritised the NHS. It was the right decision. I think everyone agrees on that. But the idea that Keir Starmer can come along and say, oh, I'll wave a magic wand and make the economy grow much faster. They made the economy totally crash and tank and doubled unemployment the last time they were in. So we're not going to have any lessons from these guys.
The Conservatives have been in power since 2010, so many of these decisions which we are about to talk about
no one believes you can just wave a wand and the economy will go much faster and you can increase spending and cut taxes. It just
all right, well, I'm going to wave my wand. I'm going to wave my wand and end this
second.
particular discussion and move on to levelling up, which is actually going to be outlined or fleshed out later today. It is a cornerstone of your government, of course. We're expecting to hear from Michael Gove later on. Now, money isn't everything. You've been saying the Labour Party wants to wave a magic wand to deal with the economic problems, but not having enough money to actually achieve what has been set out, which is pretty ambitious in terms of levelling up parts of the UK, it's not going to happen without real money. And there isn't really any new money, is there?
No, the spending review set out huge sums of increased investment.
Yeah, but there's nothing new being announced today, is there?
And today we are setting out what we'll be doing that. So, give an example. On the one hand, you say everything is not about new money, and you're right. So, under Labour, the only part of England that got devolution and responsibility and power was London. the richest part of the UK. We've changed that. We've done devolution for Liverpool, Manchester, and today we're going to
level down. Does London and the South East need to level down?
London doesn't need to be levelled down. Absolutely not. There are poor parts of London. But the thing is, if you give power and extra money and extra ability to attract inward investment only to the richest part of the country, then you're going to unbalance the economy. You're going to have a more balanced approach where other parts of the country get power too. And that never happened under Labour. And you've got to have the institutions that can help regenerate these places. As I said, Labour got rid of English Partnerships, the government's regeneration agency. We are putting 1.5 billion today into the Brownfield Regeneration Fund. We're going to regenerate 20 places like King's Cross. The guy who did King's Cross is going to be put in charge of it. And we're going to see the kind of brownfield, urban, inner-city regeneration that my constituents want to see.
You'll be judged on delivery.
Absolutely, and we're happy to be.
Today, there's ambitious language, certainly setting out these 12 missions, they're being called, or targets, that Michael Gove is outlining. You surely welcome the principle behind all this?
Well, it would look more realistic if they hadn't spent the last 12 years doing the polar opposite. But their mission is very, very vague targets set to be delivered in 2 general elections, 2 parliaments' time. So they think they can avoid being held to account for what they're really doing. And what they're really doing, I said it earlier, cutting education next year by 9% in real terms compared to 2010. In real terms, compared to when the government was elected, cut it by 9%.
Neil and Steve, no one can hear you. No. Nobody can hear you. And hang on school spending, let's just clear it up. School spending in cash terms is going up. What's happening to it per head in real terms?
It is going up in real terms over the course of this spending review. Let me end on a note of consensus here, right? Steve is right that during the coalition years we did some very difficult things and we squeezed down spending. It went down
dramatically
to 2015.
Local government.
Just let me finish this non-partisan point. Local government, education, health, all these things. It was a tough period during the coalition years. But you should also recognise that since then things have changed. Local government spending up in real terms next year. School spending up in real terms next year. So we we have cleaned up their mess.
There are 500,000
Conservative government's mess. Steve,
we are now investing in our public services.
Neil, would you like to let me get a word in? There are 500,000 more children in poverty as a result of the government that you've backed since 2010. That isn't levelling the country up. That is pulling the country apart. You've got a new funding formula for local government that in very Orwellian terms you call the fair funding formula that takes deprivation indicators out of how money is allocated because you intend to reduce funding to poorer areas to funnel it into richer areas. There are 15,000 fewer police and uniformed officers on our streets than there were in 2010 when the government came in because you've ripped this country apart. Massive high rates of inflation, record rates of personal tax, wages the lowest they've been since the 30s. You are trashing this economy, breaking people's household budgets, and this empty shell of a levelling up bill. You must be so disappointed. There's not a penny of new money in it.
All right, on this, competing visions, of course, of the economy, and we really are back to bread and butter issues here. But on levelling up, politically, how difficult is that going to be in terms of delivery for the government by the time of the next election?
Well, I think I'm going to bring a referee's whistle next week. There's nothing wrong with a good old ding-dong in argument, but I think we had just a little preview of the next general election campaign, in fact, because I think this bread and butter issue is going to be hugely important in the coming months. Certainly, people in government are very worried about how people are going to feel about their own finances and how they're able to make ends meet with inflation where it is. How that then is challenging for the government in terms of these ambitions that are there in the Levelling Up paper. How on earth do they translate that into things that people see in their own communities, particularly for Conservatives, people who voted Tory for the first time? What is going to feel real in their life that they go, that's better for me and my family because I made a different political choice? And there is quite a lot of highfalutin language around this levelling up agenda. Nothing wrong with that, but it is a huge challenge for the Conservatives to turn this into actual brass tacks differences that will be felt in communities around the country. And the targets are really far in the future. 2030
and beyond.
And the Tories have been in charge since 2010. Not easy.
No. Something else that is not easy and extremely difficult for the Metropolitan Police. I know that was a little bit of a handbrake turn into a completely different subject, but let me just show you.
We're no stranger to doing that, Jo, on this programme.
This tweet from the former Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott. Yet another revelation about racism, sexism and bad behaviour by the Met Police. Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan, she says, has presided over the Met since 2017. She is not the person to lead reform. Hashtag Cressida must go. How much trouble are they in? How much trouble is she in?
I think the Met has been in repeated problems, on all sorts of issues for quite some time. There has been a lot of tension between the Met and government, again, for a long time. Remember, though, that Cressida Dick was extended in her job for another 2 years, but actually I understand the Home Office is going to start the recruitment for her replacement this summer.
Right. You're a London MP. Should she go?
Well, I mean, what we saw in those tweets is disgusting. It's despicable.
And
it's
these
fully
are the WhatsApp
fully
messages
unacceptable.
Between police officers. They're messages, not tweets.
Absolutely. Sorry, messages. Yes. Yeah. But this problem isn't restricted only to the Met. We've also seen similar problems in Sussex, in Hampshire, in Leicestershire, in Scotland.
Should she go as the woman in charge of the Metropolitan Police Force?
I've written to Cressida Dick and I've asked for a meeting, and I'm looking forward to getting that meeting in very, very short measure. But we need to recognise these problems are going on in other police forces. Where's the leadership from Priti Patel in the Home Office? Because that's where it should be coming from.
Apparently has said she's going to have challenging conversations. I don't know what they will look like with Cressida Dick, but that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for a noisy half hour, and I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.